This week, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that embryos are people regardless of their location. Whether in the womb, in the freezer, or at the beach, the court stated that the unborn had a right to life. The implications of this decision rocked the lucrative business of in vitro fertilization, which had to be paused throughout the state. Reproductive doctors were worried that if given the chance to think about the moral implications of this relatively new scientific advancement, then people in the state might not support it. And then how would those doctors be able to afford that skiing trip to Switzerland they all had planned? And ultimately, isn't that what life is really about? Assistant Secretary of Health Rachel Levine stated in a press conference that Republicans are so backwards in their way of thinking that they sound like Democrats from the 90s, and that they should just follow the science. Levine did not stay after the press conference for questioning, as she had to dip out because she was late for her prostate exam. Joe Biden stated as a devout Catholic, he was troubled by the religious encroachment on secularism and remembered that he and Corn Pop used to read Dr. Seuss and isn't red fish, blue fish, one fish, two fish a funny rhyme? Where am I? Who are these people? He then gazed off into the distance like a man staring into the sun until ushered off to bed by Secret Service. I'm Tyler Chrestman. Welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. Okay, as we were saying in the intro there, we're going to be talking about in vitro fertilization today on the podcast, as well as this Republican Supreme Court in Alabama and some of the implications that this could have moving forward for Republicans and their electoral chances and all that sort of fun stuff. Now, this topic is a complicated one, like most of the things we talk about here on the podcast, because there are going to be reasonable people on both sides of this argument when it comes to IVF. I'm going to go into my feelings on it a little bit later, but a lot of people at this point know someone who has gone through IVF, or someone who, maybe even at this point, people who were born through IVF. And so you say there's always a hard case to be made that when you argue against something that has a positive outcome for some people. Okay, so you take a person that you know and you love who was able to have a child because of IVF or was actually born because of IVF, and then you try and argue on the opposite side of that why it has negative moral implications, and it's very difficult to do because the obvious good outcome that you're looking at doesn't necessarily negate the fact on the other side. So we're going to talk about all that today and try and break it down a little bit to give people some good arguments on both sides of this issue. First of all, for those people who don't understand what in vitro fertilization is, a brief summary of how it occurs. Basically, you're harvesting an egg. You remove an egg from the ovaries and you fertilize it with sperm. This is done outside the body in a lab. The fertilized egg, whether it's inside the womb, done naturally or through IVF, a fertilized egg is called an embryo. Now, the embryo at that point is in IVF is then returned to the womb where it is allowed to grow and develop. Oh my gosh, excuse me. Now, the procedure, IVF, in its infancy, it has been around since the 70s. So it's not the newest thing in the world, but it is relatively new, and the advancement and the prevalence of it has certainly gotten greater, especially in the last decade to 15 years. Now, because of that, every time we have an advancement in medicine or something that has to do with human life or extending it or things like euthanasia, anything, there are moral implications about IVF. Now, the Alabama Supreme Court this week, the court case, there was a court case that was brought. 3 couples, so you have 6 people. 6 people brought a lawsuit against a fertility clinic in Alabama because their frozen embryos were destroyed by the facility. Now, they were suing because they were saying that the fertility clinic killed their children by destroying these embryos without consent. Now, this case went all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, and this is a quote from the ruling. It said, quote, an 1872 state law allowing parents to sue over the death of a minor child applies to all unborn children regardless of their location. And I have a couple quotes from the justices here. Justice J. Mitchell said, quote, Unborn children are children, without exception, based on developmental stage, physical location, or any other ancillary characteristics, end quote. Chief Justice Tom Parker stated, this is another quote, even before birth, all human beings bear the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without effacing his glory, end quote. Now, obviously, you see where the Alabama Supreme Court is coming from in their ruling, why they are ruling the way that they did. And they ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, that the law says that you can sue for the death of a minor child. So parents can do that when it comes to the death or the destruction of an embryo. They are allowed to sue fertility clinics. Now, this brought up a couple arguments about the separation for church and state. This is one of the most misunderstood things in all of law and all of the Constitution. People just don't understand what they're talking about when they talk about the separation of church and state. First of all, that phrase never appears in the Constitution ever. There's nothing in the Constitution about the separation of church and state, whether you're talking about the original 7 articles or the 27 amendments. It does not exist. The closest you get is the First Amendment to the Constitution in 1791. When the Bill of Rights were ratified, you have the First Amendment, which states that Congress shall establish no religion. I think that's the exact wording. I'd have to look it up. But basically, the idea was that there was not going to be a state religion that Congress, the federal government, was going to establish. So they were going to say you could practice whatever religion you wanted, but Congress would establish no laws about establishing a religion of choice for America. The separation for church and state is actually, it took place about a decade after that, when Thomas Jefferson, he wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. This is in 1802. And in the letter, he's talking about the First Amendment, and he's trying to explain the U.S. Constitution. And he was the one who used the phrase separation of church and state. I actually pulled up the excerpt from the letter so we could read it. So here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson's letter in 1802. Quote, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, and that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." Now that's end quote. That is where that phrase come from. But all it states is that Congress is not going to make a law. It doesn't mean that we can't elect someone who is religious and they can't use their religious practices to make judgments or decisions. So when people talk about, well, the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court is violating church and state, the separation of church and state, they're not actually being accurate. He's allowed to have those opinions. He's allowed to say that. He's allowed to use the rationale to make decisions. He can do that. Whether you think he should or not, it is his right to do that. And to say, well, this is what I believe, here's why, and make those decisions. He's allowed to do that. This is just an offshoot of the thing that people fail to understand often about what the actual separation of church and state is. It doesn't mean what people think it means. So the Alabama Supreme Court rules that way. They state that embryos are people. Embryos have all of the protections that a minor child would have. This makes the states this makes the fertility clinics in the state of Alabama shut down because they're worried about what the implications are. And they have a right to be based on the ruling because it is a little tricky. Now, there was a bill passed that basically exempted fertility clinics from being held liable. The legislature in Alabama just passed this. I think Republicans got a lot of pushback on this week. If you're watching the news, if you're reading the New York Times, if you're watching anything, then you saw that this was a big deal this last week for Republicans. It's one of those things that it could be a losing issue, but it highlights the difference between Republicans and Democrats and the pro-life and pro-choice movements. This has always been the abortion issue ties really closely into this because it's always been an issue of having two separate conversations at once. People, the pro-life side and the pro-choice side, they do not talk to each other because they do not use the same language. And when you don't use the same language, you cannot have a conversation. They have two separate conversations and they think they're having one conversation, but it's entirely different because there is no negotiation with someone who is pro-life. If you're a Catholic, the Catholic doctrine states that life begins at conception. That is what it is. So if you're Catholic, that means that the moment that the sperm fertilizes the egg and you create an embryo, you have human life. That's what that means. Now, again, you can believe that or not believe that. That's fine. That's your choice. I don't care what you believe. I'm just telling you what people believe. What people believe is that there are people who sit there and they are pro-life. And that means to them that an embryo is a human life. And if it's a human life, then when you, for example, have an abortion, you are killing a human being. That's why there are people who will say that there's 1 million deaths a year in the United States from abortion, and they really believe that you are killing 1 million people a year with abortion in the United States. Now, that's a conversation you can't have with a pro-choice person who says, well, that's not a real human being because X, Y, and Z. Now, my argument, even though I do not believe that necessarily that life begins in conception, I will say it is the most coherent argument that either side makes. The problem with the pro-choice side of this argument is that it's always been arbitrary because you refuse to define what life is except by some measure that you pick out. So, for example, you say, oh, well, it doesn't count because an embryo doesn't feel pain until this amount of weeks. Oh, it doesn't have a heartbeat until 10 days. Oh, it doesn't have freedom of choice or free will, or it can't make decisions, or it doesn't have any brain activity. Whatever it is, it's arbitrary. Whatever you're picking, whatever your definition of life is, you can find examples on the other side. It's arbitrary. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny a lot of the time. And again, this is coming from someone who is not on the life begins at conception side. I am acknowledging the failings of the pro-choice side because the pro-life side is easy because sperm meets egg, you create an embryo. That's an easy thing to point to and say, look, it's very simple because you're taking these two separate things and you're creating something new. And when you create something new, there it is. That's what the human being is. And if allowed to grow, it's going to become a human being because it has potential for life. Now, that argument makes sense. But you can't have both of these arguments if people don't believe what a human being is. If you can't agree on when the human life starts, you're not going to have an agreement on abortion. And now IVF is in that same camp. It's going to be hard to have a conversation moving forward about IVF because if you are of the opinion that egg meets sperm, that is life, then when a doctor says, okay, well, we have an armful of embryos here, we're going to stick them in a freezer, and then you get to pick and choose which embryos you want. We'll implant a couple knowing that a couple of them are probably not going to take, and then these other ones we'll just throw them in the fire. Yeah, we don't need them. We'll just get rid of them. Well, that's a big problem. And are there moral implications to that if you're creating 10 embryos and then you get to say, well, this one's got Down syndrome, throw it away. This one, we want a boy, so throw these girls away. Oh, it sounds a little like eugenics to me when you say it like that. And again, I'm not saying IVF is the most evil thing that's ever happened ever. I'm not saying that at all. But is it good to say, well, we created these 10 embryos, why don't you have your pick of the litter? Is that a good policy? If you want a boy and we throw away all the girl embryos, is that good? Is that a good thing? Is that a moral thing to do? We say, oh, we've got these, we've determined that they're going to be female, chuck them in the trash, we criticize places like China for their one-child policy that resulted in a lot of young girls being killed or aborted, or in India or places like this where if you have a female that will say, oh, it's wrong to abort them, but IVF is giving you the choice to do that, where you can just chuck them away and you say, it's not a big deal because it's just an embryo. Well, okay, but is that an issue? Is that a problem? Should we talk about it? Should we have a real conversation about whether that's a good thing? Because to me, the other side of the argument, the side that just says IVF is great, no problems, no questions, I say I'm open to it. It's fine. I'm open to it. We can have a discussion. But to pretend, this has always been my issue with everything, to pretend that we know all the answers is always the thing that drives me insane, because we don't know all the answers. And when we pretend, then what you're doing is you're just not allowing yourself the chance to grow, and you're stifling conversation. And that's not a good thing for society. So that's all it is. The questions about the future of IVF, have people considered, have we really gotten to the bottom of the philosophy of whether or not IVF has any problems whatsoever? I don't think so. I think that there's a good question about that. Should you be able to pick and choose all the characteristics of children? This is that CRISPR argument too. The idea that you're going to be able to select the eye color of your baby, or how tall they're going to be, or whatever the case may be. Is this a good thing? Is it a good technology? We're doing that to some extent with IVF. It's not the same, obviously, but saying we're going to create 10 to 20 embryos, and then we're going to implant a bunch, and then if you, let's say 3 take, for example, but you only want 1, we'll just get rid of 2 of them, and then that's fine. And you say, well, I mean, is that really fine? Is it really good? Do we really know for a fact that that is okay? I don't know. I don't know. So I'm just asking. I don't know. Do you know? Do we all just have an agreement on what is good and what is bad? So that's why I think this law is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Alabama's entitled to do what Alabama wants to do. I don't live in Alabama. I'm not going to tell them how to run their state. It's not my job. It's the right of the state of Alabama to determine how Alabama wants to construct their laws. I get that. So, but is it going to happen other places? Are other places going to enshrine this in law? It's a losing thing for Republicans, by the way. You've seen Republicans this past week running away from this decision because they don't know. They don't know. I saw some very prominent Republicans give really bad answers when pressed on this issue. And the truth is, because it's a hard thing to think about, it's a hard thing to know the correct answer about. And to pretend that you do puts you at all sorts of liability if you wind up being wrong. I think it's better to take a stand one way or the other, or to at least come out there and say, I don't know. I don't know the answers. But most people aren't doing that. Most people are just giving sort of non-answers to the question as to whether or not IVF should be allowed in their state. And I think that you got to think about it. You got to think about these things. Because a lot of people are saying, well, pro-life people, we want more people. Okay, well, that's fine. That's good. But pro-life people also don't like the destruction of embryos. And that's what an abortion is. You're taking what they call the cluster of cells, or as a baby, and you're cutting it up into pieces, and you're sucking it up in a vacuum and spitting it out. Or you're taking a pill that basically causes it to miscarry, and it's fine. Okay, all right. But now Republicans who are saying that's bad, abortion's bad, they're sitting out here and they're defending IVF, and I want to know, well, what do you say is the difference? I get it. IVF results in more babies because people are trying to have kids. I get that. But what about the embryos that aren't used? Do they sit in a freezer for the rest of forever? Are we allowing them to be destroyed? How is that different than abortion? These are things to think about. And if you're pro-life, they are questions you have to answer. And if you're pro-choice, your answer is, well, I don't care, because you don't think they're people anyway, so there's an answer. But the pro-life side has to answer for it. They have to answer the difference. They have to explain themselves on this issue. They are going to be held to account. And just like abortion seems like overall the Roe v. Wade kicking it back to the states, I think it's a good thing. I don't think Roe v. Wade was good judicial law. I think it's fine for states to make their own abortion laws. I don't see what the issue with that is. But it has been a losing issue for Republicans. Republicans have lost these elections where abortion rights are on the ballot. And it's important to know that the IVF thing, it could be the same way. You saw Donald Trump come out this week and say, basically instruct everybody to run the opposite direction of this, and you've seen Republicans fall in lockstep. But again, you're the one the Republicans out there, the pro-lifers, they're the ones who are going to have to answer for the difference. You have to explain to me why IVF's good and abortion's bad. I have one opinion on this that I know. I've just said that I've spent this whole time saying I don't know the answer. I don't know what all the moral implications of IVF are. I'll say this. If you want to have children and you have the money and you can do all this stuff, that's great. I don't know. I think it's more expensive. The problem with only creating a few embryos or one embryo or two, however many they do at a time, instead of creating a whole bunch, is it's more expensive. You have to do more rounds of IVF. You have to try more often. Okay, well, maybe that's just the way that the process works. The one opinion that I have on this entire thing is I have come down on the side that surrogacy is not a good thing. This is something I have thought about this quite a bit. I am not for this at all. And it's taken me a while to get there because I never used to see the problem with it because I always have more of a libertarian leaning on most things, thinking that you should be able to do with your body what you want. Do whatever you want. That's why I've never been necessarily for the criminalization of prostitution or things like that because I'm of the opinion, drugs for the most part, do what you want as long as it doesn't affect somebody else, right? That idea, we always say it, the idea that you can wave your hand in the air as long as you're not slapping me in the face. If you want to do something with your body, go for it. And I've come around on the prostitution thing mostly because I think it has a lot of negative effects for women. If it was just one of those things where a woman could sell her body and make money and that's what she wanted to do and it made her happy, that's great. But I think that you open yourself up as a society inherently to the exploitation of women. I just don't see a way around that is doable. And part of this now has led into my issue with surrogacy. Surrogacy, to me, there are some gigantic moral implications for surrogacy and why I'm not for it. One of them is I find it really distasteful. There's just something, it's hard to put into words exactly what it is. There's something really distasteful about the idea that we're renting poor women for their wombs. Because you know who's not doing this? A lot of really rich women. A lot of really rich women are not just carrying babies for strangers. And you know why? Because they have money. But what we're doing is we're taking poor women and we're renting the wombs of poor people to have babies for rich people. There's a giant moral problem with that for me. I don't know how you justify it because it's not the same as finding some woman who's having a baby and wants to give it up for adoption because she's not ready to be a mom or this and that. You're saying there are people out there who are taking their sperm and their egg from a woman, making an embryo, taking that embryo and implanting it in a third party. And that to me is just entirely distasteful. It's so mind-bogglingly weird that everyone's just happy. It's so great. We're going to have a baby. And don't look at her. This is our poor servant wench. She's not going to be in the picture. She's going to do all the work. She's not going to be in the picture, though. We're not going to have a picture of the baby and her. When the baby's done, we're going to rip that baby away from her, and we'll put it on my chest, and we'll take all the maternity pictures. That's weird. That's a weird thing to me. I don't see it as a positive benefit for society. You could make a different case. Let's say if it's you're a woman and you have an issue and you have a sister and your sister agrees to carry your baby. Again, I think it's kind of strange. It's going to be a little difficult to explain because you're like, oh, well, you're actually from my egg, but you're from her womb. So whatever, again, strange, but less strange than the idea that we're going to pay someone $50,000 to $100,000 to just carry a baby they have nothing to do with. That to me is distasteful. I've come around on that opinion because I don't see a way. The commodification of human beings is not a good thing. It's why I'm against being able to sell your organs. You know, if I have a liver, my liver regenerates. I say, well, what if I want to go in there and I want to just sell part of my liver to someone who needs a transplant? Is that a good thing? No, it's not a good thing because you know who doesn't do it is rich people. It is something that it exploits the poor. That's what we're doing with surrogacy. We are exploiting poor women for their wombs. That's weird and not good. And I have 2 kidneys. I can't go sell a kidney. Why? Why not? It's my body. I only need one. I could sell one. No, because you're exploiting poor people for the benefit of rich people, and that is not okay. It's not good. You say, oh, well, who gets hurt? The poor person gets money, as if money is the end-all, be-all, and because someone agrees to something, it makes it moral. It doesn't make it moral. It doesn't make it good. The idea that capitalism has its failings, believe it or not, as somebody who's very pro-capitalism, it does have its failings. And here is where it is. The market will not fix every moral problem. It will not fix the problem of surrogacy. Because if I give someone enough money, they will do things that are immoral because money can change your life. And you say, well, my life will be better with the money. But the act itself is degrading. The act itself is what makes your life worse, even if you don't see it because the money blinds you, because money has that ability to do that. So no, I'm not for surrogacy, even though I'm not coming out against IVF. I'm just saying, ask yourself these questions. Ask yourself if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Ask yourself about what happens to the extra embryos. Ask yourself if it's good. We should be able to pick and choose our children that we're going to have, like eugenics. Ask yourself all of these questions. And whatever answer you come up with is the answer you come up with, as long as you can justify your answer with a response. But don't pretend to just society has it all figured out. And if you can come up with a good argument about surrogacy to me, I would love to hear it. This has been a topic I've been more of a deep dive into than IVF in general, is the idea of surrogacy. I don't see it. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this. We're going to leave it there. Let me know what you guys think about IVF, surrogacy, what you think the Republican strategy for this should be. That's a big one. I am very curious to hear what people have to say about this issue, because sometimes you stand on principle, and standing on principle will only lose you the battle. That is true. And you have to say, would you rather someone be ideologically pure, 100% on board, full guns ablazing on your position, and lose, or someone who's not quite as adherent to what you would expect or what you would want, but they get things done. They win elections, and they will practically move the needle a little bit. I am of the opinion that the latter is better. You don't need someone who's going to just be a zealot and lose. What you need is someone who can move the needle in the direction you want, even if it's slightly in that direction. Or, at worst, someone who prevents the needle from swinging the other way. If you put up someone who's a zealot and they lose every election every time, well, eventually the law turns the other way because you're not pushing in the direction you need. You don't have the legislature on your side. Those are the people who make the laws. Winning those elections is important. If for whatever side you're on, for what you want to happen, you have to win elections to do it. So anyway, let me know what the Republican Party should do, or what the Democratic Party should do. I want to know do you think the Democratic strategy is exploiting it? Let me know. Just put it in the comments. As always, we love questions, comments, concerns, feedback, all that good stuff. Anything you got. I am going to leave it there for the week. I'm Tyler Chrestman. I'll catch you guys next Friday.